At 9:47 in the morning, America made a decision that changed everything. No warning, no transition period, no emergency meetings with industry leaders. Just a short statement from the White House that hit the economy like a lightning strike. Effective immediately, Canadian workers would no longer be allowed to work in the United States. And within minutes, the system started breaking. Not slowly, not eventually, immediately. Because what most people never realized is that the North American economy was never truly divided by borders in the first place. It was stitched together by millions of invisible connections. Truck drivers, rail engineers, pipeline inspectors, mechanics, technicians, logistics managers. People crossing back and forth every day so consistently that entire industries stopped thinking about where one country ended and the other began. Until suddenly, those workers disappeared. And when they did, America discovered something terrifying. The economy had no backup plan. At first, the announcement almost felt unreal. Television networks scrambled to confirm the details. Business executives stared at their phones trying to understand whether this was political theater or actual policy. Financial markets froze in confusion because nobody had modeled a shock like this before. Trade wars? Yes. Tariffs? Of course. Sanctions? Markets understand those. But instantly removing hundreds of thousands of skilled workers from an integrated economy? That was different. The algorithms on Wall Street didn't know how to react because modern economies are designed around predictability. And this was chaos. Within less than an hour, the first real-world consequences started appearing far away from Washington. In rail yards, factories, and energy facilities most politicians rarely think about. In North Dakota, freight trains carrying wheat suddenly stopped moving because many cross-border routes relied on Canadian locomotive engineers legally operating inside the United States under long-standing agreements. Those engineers were now banned from working. The trains sat still. Thousands of tons of grain sat trapped on tracks. And somewhere across the Pacific Ocean, international buyers immediately started calling suppliers in Australia instead. That's how global business works. The world doesn't wait for political arguments to calm down. It simply moves on. And once supply chains move somewhere else, they rarely come back completely. That was the first hidden truth this crisis exposed. The economy isn't just built on products. It's built on people with specialized knowledge. People who cannot simply be replaced overnight. A politician can announce a policy in 30 seconds. But you cannot replace a trained rail engineer in 30 seconds. Or 30 days. Or even 30 months sometimes. Many of these jobs require years of training, certifications, and experience that very few workers possess. And suddenly, entire industries realized they had become dependent on labor nobody had planned to lose. Then the energy sector started panicking. One of the biggest vulnerabilities sat underground beneath the Great Lakes region. Pipelines carrying oil and fuel between Canada and the United States. These systems require constant inspection and maintenance from highly specialized engineers, many of whom happen to be Canadian workers living and operating legally inside America. Corrosion specialists, pressure system technicians, safety inspectors. The kinds of jobs most people never hear about until something fails catastrophically. Those workers were suddenly gone too. And that's when executives realized the nightmare scenario. Pipelines cannot simply be turned off like a light switch. Stopping them safely requires carefully coordinated shutdown procedures performed by the same workers who had just lost authorization to work. Within hours, energy markets exploded with uncertainty. Oil prices jumped. Gasoline futures surged, not because the pipelines had failed yet, but because traders understood something politicians often ignore. Fear itself becomes expensive. The possibility of disruption can move markets before disruption even happens. And once panic spreads through energy systems, everything downstream becomes vulnerable. Transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, food prices. The entire economy starts feeling pressure. Meanwhile, another crisis was quietly forming in factories across the northern United States. Heavy manufacturing depends on maintenance crews most Americans never think about. The workers crawling underneath locomotives repairing brake systems. The mechanics rebuilding diesel engines inside freezing repair yards. The technicians calibrating industrial machinery so production lines keep moving. Many of those workers were Canadian too, not because companies wanted to outsource jobs, but because North American industries evolved together for decades under trade agreements that encouraged labor mobility across borders. Executives assumed those systems would always exist, until suddenly they didn't. And what made this crisis especially dangerous was timing. Factories don't maintain huge backup inventories anymore. Modern supply chains are built around just-in-time delivery systems designed for maximum efficiency. That works beautifully during stability, but during disruption, it becomes terrifyingly fragile. One missing component can stop entire production lines. One delayed shipment can create millions of dollars in losses. One labor shortage can freeze operations across multiple states. That fragility became painfully obvious almost immediately. Ports slowed down. Rail schedules collapsed. Shipping companies began rerouting cargo. Insurance claims surged as delays created spoilage risks for food and medical products. And every hour the uncertainty continued. International buyers quietly started looking for alternatives outside the United States altogether. Because global markets care about one thing above almost everything else: reliability. Not patriotism, not politics, reliability. And once companies lose confidence in a supply chain, rebuilding that trust becomes incredibly difficult. But perhaps the most ironic part of this entire crisis was who suffered first. The political rhetoric leading up to the policy focused heavily on protecting American workers. Yet within hours, American workers themselves were being caught in the fallout. Some Americans living and working in Canada suddenly found payroll systems frozen amid retaliatory financial restrictions. Freelancers couldn't access payments. Remote workers faced banking disruptions. Cross-border businesses scrambled to understand rapidly changing rules. And the economy began behaving less like a modern system and more like a machine pulling itself apart. Agriculture may have suffered the most shocking consequences of all. Because farming doesn't wait for politics. Seasons move whether governments are prepared or not. And in the northern plains, spring planting season depends heavily on specialized Canadian agricultural technicians who service equipment, calibrate seed treatment systems, and help prepare massive planting operations within extremely narrow time windows. Those workers disappeared too. Suddenly, thousands of acres faced the possibility of going unplanted. Not because farmers lacked land, not because they lacked demand, but because modern agriculture had become dependent on highly specialized cross-border labor systems nobody ever imagined would suddenly vanish. International grain buyers reacted immediately. Italian pasta manufacturers, Asian wheat importers, global commodity traders. Contracts started shifting away from American suppliers within hours. And once again, the lesson was brutal. Global markets do not wait for political recovery. They adapt instantly. Then came the deeper realization spreading quietly through boardrooms and government agencies. This wasn't simply a labor crisis. It was a systems crisis. For decades, North America built one giant interconnected economic machine, while pretending the national borders inside it still operated independently. But they didn't. Not anymore. Canadian workers supported American industries. American companies depended on Canadian logistics. Energy systems crossed borders constantly. Transportation systems operated like shared infrastructure. The economies had fused together so deeply that suddenly trying to separate them created shockwaves nobody fully understood. And perhaps the scariest part? Government agencies themselves seemed unprepared. One department could cancel work authorization. Another tracked labor shortages. Another monitored economic stability. But nobody appeared fully responsible for understanding how the entire integrated system functioned together. It was like discovering the engine of an airplane had been built by different teams who never actually discussed how all the pieces connected. And now the engine was failing mid-flight. Meanwhile, Canada responded far faster than many expected. Prime Minister Mark Carney approached the crisis less like a politician and more like a central banker managing a financial emergency. Calm, precise, strategic. Instead of emotional retaliation, Canada focused on pressure points. Financial compliance rules tightened. Cargo priorities shifted. Trade flows began rerouting toward Europe and Asia. And perhaps most importantly, Canada signaled something international markets immediately understood.